You've probably heard of the Pareto principle. Among other things, there's a promise that you can get lots of benefit with a little effort. And that sounds nice, so we should have a look at that. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung, and today I'd like to present to you the Pareto principle, also known as the 80-20 rule. It is named after the guy who invented it, which was one Vilfredo Pareto, an Italian economist who lived around the turn of the 19th to 20th century. He was actually born in France and died in Switzerland, but he lived in Italy most of the time and was the son of an Italian family. He wrote a number of books on economics, which I have admittedly not read, too complicated and not really my main field of interest. The one that contains the interesting part is called Cours d'économie politique, Volume 2. There we have a description of the so-called Pareto distribution. Because Pareto noticed that distribution is often not even, but on the contrary, there is an extreme shift to one side. For example, in Italy, Pareto observed that a small part of the population, 20% of the population, owned a majority of the land, owned a majority of the ground, 80%. So 20% of Italians owned 80% of the land. And there are many other situations, many other cases where we have a similar extreme inequality. For example, if we consider cities and population. In each country there are a couple of big major cities that house a majority of the population, and there is a huge load of smaller cities and villages that house only a small part in comparison of the population. Or a quite popular example is the inequality in income. A small group of people earn a majority of the income, and there are plenty more examples. And Pareto came up with a way to describe those situations of inequality mathematically. With a formula I admittedly don't really understand. It is beyond my very basic understanding of math, but there is a variable in that formula that describes the degree of inequality. If there is extreme inequality, so for example, if one person has the entire income and everybody else has nothing at all, then this variable approaches 1. And if there is total equality, so for example, if everybody earns exactly the same, this variable approaches infinity. Now, as I mentioned, the Pareto principle is also known as the 80-20 rule. Based on this 80-20 distribution, Pareto observed in regard to ownership of land in Italy. However, this 80-20 distribution, this 80-20 relation is obviously more like a rule of thumb. We don't have exactly 80%, 20% in most cases. To give you an example, in regard to income distribution, Pareto himself wrote in his books that in different countries this income inequality, for that income inequality, this variable, this Pareto coefficient, has a value of about 1.5, which would mean that 20%, the richest 20%, would earn 58% of the overall income, not 80%. So from Pareto's point of view, the inequality was lower than 80-20. In our modern world, the inequality tends to be even higher. I found statistics from 2010 in regard not to income but to wealth, and it states that in 2010 worldwide the richest 10% of the population owned 85% of the total wealth. And this statistic was criticized for not taking all kinds of assets into account. So the inequality probably is even higher than that. And it has probably increased since 2010. So today actually it is worse than 80-20. So as I said, this 80-20 relationship, that is merely a rule of thumb. It is not some strange natural law or anything. Speaking about even more drastic inequality, there is an interesting note from Nassim Taleb from his book The Black Swan, which we had a look at here in the channel. In The Black Swan, Nassim Taleb points out that if you have an 80-20 distribution, you also have a 50-1 distribution. Now, what does that mean? Let's have a look at an example. Let's say we have 100 people, and among this 100 people, we have an 80-20 income distribution. So 20%, which means 20 people of those 100, earn 80% of the total income. Now, what Nassim Taleb points out is I can now zoom in on this group of 20 high-income people, and among those 20 people, I can again apply this 80-20 distribution. So among those 20 people, there are probably a few, 20%, that earn way more than all the others. So among those 20 people, I probably have about 4 people who own 80% of the income in that small group and who own 64% of the total income in the whole group of 100 people. And I can repeat this process. Among those 4 people, I have, let's say, 1 person who owns 80% in this group of 4 people and who earns 50% of the overall income in this whole group of 100 people. Now, this is quite an interesting thing Taleb pointed out here. I can't tell if it is exactly correct on a mathematical level. Maybe the curve can become steeper or things like that. But it is certainly a valid point and a good concept. Now you might wonder, what do we do with this knowledge, with this Pareto principle, 80-20 distribution? What's it good for? So far, it's more of a fun fact. So we have extreme inequality, which is not very nice in a lot of cases, such as in regard to income. But the Pareto principle is often presented like a kind of tool we can use. So how do we do that? The idea is that we keep this concept of extreme inequality, uneven distribution, that we keep that in mind in our daily lives and apply it. For example, if I have several tasks I need to finish and I want to prioritize those tasks, I can keep the Pareto principle in mind and say, all right, which of those tasks contribute the most to my overall progress, and then I can do those first. For prioritizing your tasks, I would recommend the Eisenhower matrix, which we already discussed on the channel. I will link to it in the video description, but it's still good to keep the Pareto principle in mind. A very good area to apply the Pareto principle is when you're trying to overcome perfectionism. Perfectionism means you apply too much work and effort, even though you won't gain a lot anymore. For example, let's say you have to write some document and you have written the document and you have checked it and you have done some fine tuning. You went over it again and again and made small improvements, and now it's basically finished, but because you're a perfectionist, you will go over it several more times, even though the time and effort you invest will only produce a minimal gain. And there the Pareto principle can be helpful to understand this and to accept that the document is good enough even if it isn't 100% perfect. You can also apply the Pareto principle in business. Actually, we encountered an example when we had the book review for The Big Five for Life by John Strelecky. In this book, in the story, there is an article written by one of the protagonists called How to Boost Profits in 4 Simple Steps. And the first of those 4 steps is to find and strengthen your pillars. The pillars refer to those customers that contribute most to your overall profit, to your overall income. Because, of course, in business, you can apply the Pareto principle as well. If you have a company and you have customers, your income isn't spread evenly among those customers, but you will have a couple of customers who buy a lot from you, who contribute a lot to your overall income, and you will have lots and lots of customers who only buy small amounts, who don't contribute a lot to your overall income. And Strelecky's idea here is that you should focus on those customers that contribute the most. You should give them the best support and the best offers and try to build a good relation with them and so on. And I think this is overall good advice if you don't overdo it. Because you have to keep in mind, in business, of course, everything is shifting and changing, and one of those pillars can quickly get lost. Maybe the company goes bankrupt, maybe they switch to another supplier. Either way, you lose them, and then you have to find other pillars. You have to move on to other customers who buy not quite as much, but still a lot. And if those customers all say, oh, well, yeah, that company, they always give us lousy support and not very good offers, and they neglect us, they don't pay any attention to us, and we don't like them anymore, then you will have a difficult time, obviously, so don't overdo it. That is good advice in general. For example, you can also apply the Pareto principle in management when you have to, for example, plan a project. Let's say you're planning a software development project. In a software development project, it is certainly true that at the beginning of the development time, you will get a lot of progress with little time, and near the end, you will have to put in a lot of effort to get little progress. So you might be inclined to just say, oh, well, the software is 80% finished. Let's just release it. And who cares about the last 20%? We can earn a lot of money now and we will save a lot of effort. A lot of companies have done that, and it hasn't done them much good usually, because it would mean releasing a piece of software that is full of bugs and customers don't appreciate that, and it will ruin your professional image. It will certainly cause a dwindling customer base and a really bad reputation, because the time at the end of software, of the development of a piece of software, is where you do all the testing, bug fixing, fine tuning, and that activities are very important for the overall quality of the software. You can just skip them. Of course, it does make sense when you, for example, plan what features you want to have in the software, to focus on features that are relevant to a big majority of users, and to invest a lot of time and effort into them, and not to invest too much time and effort into exotic features that are only used by a few customers. I think an area where the Pareto principle can be quite useful is when you have to do some time planning, when you have to create a schedule for some work effort. Let's say, for example, you have to create a big document for your work or for university, college, whatever, and this document has to be quite big. It will contain 10 chapters and you have 10 weeks time to do it. Now it would be quite naive to say, all right, I will write one chapter each week and then this will work out. Because every chapter you have written will probably need some fine tuning, some corrections and whatnot. You will have to go over it again. And of course, this takes time. And the more chapters you have already written, the more time you will need for revisions. So in the last of the 10 weeks, you will probably spend all your time doing revisions and you won't have time to write any new stuff anymore. So in order for the whole thing to work out, you will have to write way more than one chapter per week in the first few weeks. So here the Pareto principle can be quite helpful. And of course, it can be applied in a lot of other areas as well. A quite simple example would be your daily finances. A common mistake that a lot of people make is to pay a lot of attention to small expenses, like when you go to the shop that is further away, or you go to a few different shops instead of just one, so you can save a few cents when you buy butter, a few cents when you buy milk, and so on. And that's all well and good. However, then you make a big purchase, like for example, you buy a new car, and there you waste a few $100 on some extra feature you don't really need and that's not really worth the money. And all that saving you did over weeks, over months is suddenly wasted because you wasted so much money in one big expense. And here it's helpful to have the Pareto principle in mind and to remember I have to be especially careful when I spend lots of money at once, because those expenses make a major difference for my overall finances. So there it is most important to save some money. Finally, I would like to point out some similar rules and concepts that are related or that are similar to the Pareto principle. First of all, there is a joking rule called the 90-90 rule by one Tom Cargill from Bell Laboratories that is about software development. And Cargill says, the first 90% of the code accounts for the first 90% of development time. The remaining 10% of the code accounts for the other 90% of the development time. So here Cargill again points out the fact that near the end of a software development project, you will need to invest a lot of time and effort to really get it done and to really finish the software. Another joking rule that isn't really serious is the so-called 1% rule that applies to the internet, to online culture. It states that on the internet, 1% of users create content, provide content, while 99% of the users only read along silently without contributing. I guess in the early days of the internet this was probably true. However, in modern times of Web 2.0 and social media, where it is common to contribute yourself on all those social media channels, the relation has probably shifted a bit. Finally, there is one example that is serious, that is an important concept, that is the Gini coefficient, developed by an Italian statistician called Corrado Gini. And this is also a statistical measurement for inequality in a group. And similar to Pareto, Gini also uses a variable, the Gini coefficient, that describes how big the inequality in a group is. It ranges between 0 and 1. At 0, we have total equality, so everybody has exactly the same income, for example. And at 1, we have extreme inequality, so for example, one person has all the income and everybody else has nothing. And the Gini coefficient is used frequently to describe inequality. For example, if you have statistics, how big is the income inequality in different countries, this is usually measured using the Gini coefficient and not Pareto's approach. So it's good to know about the Gini coefficient. You will encounter it every now and then in your day-to-day lives. Well, where do you encounter the Pareto principle in your daily lives, and what do you think about the concept? Is it a helpful tool to you, or is it a mere fun fact? Let me know in the comments. That's it for today. We will see each other in the next video. For today, I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.